The ancient Celtic world stretched across a vast expanse of Europe. From the misty highlands of what is now Scotland and Ireland to the rolling plains of Gaul, and further still into the heartlands of Central Europe. This was not a single unified nation, but rather a collection of tribal peoples who shared a common language family, similar customs, and a deep connection to the land beneath their feet. During the Iron Age, roughly between 800 BCE and 100 CE, Celtic cultures flourished quietly across this enormous territory, shaping the landscape and establishing patterns of daily life that would endure for generations. The Celtic peoples lived in harmony with the rhythms of the natural world, and their settlements were built with a close awareness of the terrain around them. Villages were often nestled into hillsides or situated near rivers and streams, places where water was abundant and the land offered natural shelter from the wind and cold. The forests that covered much of Europe at this time were not obstacles to be cleared, but rather a living environment to be used carefully, a source of timber, food, and materials for tools and construction. The air in these settlements carried the quiet sounds of wood being worked and fires being tended, and the landscape around them remained largely untouched and green. Celtic society was organized around the tribe, a political and social unit that served as the foundation of daily life for most people. Each tribe occupied a defined territory, and within that territory, people lived in smaller communities and farmsteads scattered across the countryside. The tribe was led by a chief or king, though the exact nature of leadership varied from one region to another. In some areas, leadership was hereditary, passed down through families over generations. In others, chiefs were chosen through a process of selection among respected elders and warriors. Regardless of the method, the chief served as a central figure around whom the community gathered, and his household was often the largest and most important structure in the settlement. At the heart of Celtic social life was the concept of kinship and obligation. People were bound to one another through ties of blood and alliance, and these relationships governed much of how daily life was organized. Families lived close together, often within sight of one another, and the obligations that came with being part of a community were taken seriously. Hospitality was one of the most valued customs among Celtic peoples, and guests were expected to be fed and sheltered without question. This tradition of generosity extended beyond the home and into the broader social fabric of tribal life. The Druids occupied a unique and important position within Celtic society. They were not priests in the way that modern people might understand the term, but rather a class of learned individuals who served as religious leaders, teachers, judges, and advisors. Druids spent many years in training, memorizing vast amounts of knowledge that was passed down orally from one generation to the next. They held considerable authority within the tribe, and their opinions on matters of law, religion, and daily conduct carried great weight. The Druids served as a bridge between the human world and the spiritual realm, conducting rituals and ceremonies that marked the passage of the seasons and the important events of life. Daily life for most Celtic people revolved around the rhythms of agriculture and animal husbandry. The majority of the population were farmers and herders, and their days were shaped by the demands of the land and the changing of the seasons. Spring was a time of preparation when fields were plowed and seeds were sown. Summer brought the hard work of tending crops and watching over livestock as they grazed on the open pastures. Autumn was the season of harvest, when the fruits of the year's labor were gathered and stored for the coming winter. And winter, with its short days and long nights, was a time for rest, repair, and storytelling around the fires. The farmsteads of the Celtic world were modest but carefully constructed dwellings. The most common type of home was the roundhouse, a circular structure built from timber, wattle, and daub, with a thatched roof that sloped gently downward from a central peak. Inside, a fire burned at the center of the single large room, and the smoke rose slowly upward through the thatch, which also served to dry and preserve the roof over time. The air inside these homes was warm and close, carrying the smell of wood smoke and the quiet sounds of a family going about its evening routines. Sleeping areas were arranged around the edges of the room, separated by low partitions or simple screens, and the overall effect was one of warmth and shelter against the outside world. The construction of a roundhouse required skill and knowledge that was passed down through generations. The timber frame was carefully assembled, with upright posts supporting a network of rafters that held the roof in place. The walls were built by weaving smaller branches and strips of wood between the upright posts, creating a framework that was then covered with a mixture of mud and straw, known as daub. This combination of materials provided good insulation against the cold and damp, and when maintained properly, a roundhouse could stand for many years. The size of the home varied, depending on the wealth and status of the family, with larger and more elaborate structures belonging to those of higher rank. In the larger Celtic settlements, hillforts served as centers of political and social life. A hillfort was a fortified settlement built on a prominent piece of high ground, surrounded by one or more defensive ditches and wooden palisades. These were not primarily places of warfare, but rather hubs of community activity where people gathered for trade, celebration, and the conduct of tribal affairs. The hillfort provided a sense of security and a gathering place, and during times of uncertainty, the surrounding population could retreat within its walls. Inside the hillfort, a collection of roundhouses, storage buildings, and open areas created a small village in itself. The landscape of the Celtic world was marked by these hillforts, and they can still be seen today as gentle mounds and terraced hillsides across the countryside of Britain and northern France. From a distance, they would have appeared as prominent features rising above the surrounding terrain, their wooden palisades casting shadows in the afternoon light. The ditches that surrounded them were deep and carefully dug, filled with earth and stone to create a barrier that discouraged approach. Yet for those who lived within or near a hillfort, it was simply a familiar part of the landscape, a place where life carried on in its usual quiet rhythm. Food and sustenance were central concerns for Celtic communities, and the diet of most people was varied and largely seasonal. Grain crops such as wheat, barley, and oats were cultivated in the fields surrounding settlements, and these formed the staple of the daily diet. Bread was baked regularly, and porridge or gruel made from ground grain and water or milk was a common meal. Dairy products, including milk, butter, and cheese, were also important, particularly during the summer months when cows and goats were producing milk in abundance. Meat, including pork, beef, and mutton, was consumed regularly, though the amount varied depending on the season and the prosperity of the household. The Celtic peoples were skilled hunters and fishermen, and the wild foods of the countryside supplemented the products of the farm. Hazelnuts, acorns, and wild berries were gathered in season and stored for later use. Rivers and streams provided fish, and the forests offered game such as deer and wild boar. Foraging was a natural part of life for most people, and knowledge of the edible plants and animals of the local environment was passed from parents to children as a matter of course. The land was generous, and those who knew how to read its offerings could find food in almost every season. Cooking was done over the central fire in the roundhouse or in outdoor hearths during warmer months. Large clay or metal pots were used to prepare stews and soups, and flat stones or simple ovens served for baking bread. The smell of cooking food mixed with the wood smoke that filled the home, creating an atmosphere that was both warm and familiar. Meals were often communal affairs, with the entire family gathering together around the fire to eat. In larger households or during festivals, food was shared more broadly, and the tradition of hospitality meant that visitors were always offered something to eat before any other business was conducted. The working of metal was one of the most important crafts in Celtic society, and blacksmiths held a place of considerable respect within the community. Iron was widely available in Celtic territories, and the ability to smelt and shape it into tools and weapons was a valued skill. Smiths produced a wide range of items, from agricultural tools such as plows and sickles to personal objects like brooches, pins, and decorative fittings. The quality of Celtic metalwork was remarkably high, and the decorative style of Celtic craftsmen, with its flowing curves and intricate patterns, became one of the most distinctive artistic traditions of the ancient world. The smithy was a familiar feature of any Celtic settlement, and the sound of the hammer on the anvil, to be heard at various times throughout the day. The fire in the forge burned hot and steady, fed by bellows that kept the coals glowing white. The smith worked with practiced hands, shaping the heated metal into the forms he needed, drawing on years of experience and an intimate knowledge of the material. The finished pieces, whether functional or decorative, carried with them something of the skill and care that had gone into their making. Metal objects were valued possessions, and some were buried with their owners as signs of status and identity. Textile production was another important activity in Celtic daily life, and most families produced at least some of their own cloth. Sheep were kept for their wool, which was spun into thread using a drop spindle, a simple tool consisting of a weighted stick that was turned by hand. The thread was then woven on an upright loom, a frame of wood set up against the wall or in a corner of the roundhouse. Weaving was a task that occupied much of a woman's time, and the rhythmic sound of the shuttle passing back and forth through the warp threads was a constant presence in the home. The cloth produced was used for clothing, blankets, and other household items, and the quality and decoration of the textiles varied with the skill of the weaver and the importance of the occasion. Celtic clothing was practical and suited to the climate of northern and central Europe. Both men and women wore tunics, loose-fitting garments that fell to the knee or below, and these were often belted at the waist. Cloaks or capes provided warmth and protection from the rain, and these were fastened with brooches or pins, which were often elaborately decorated. Trousers or breeches were worn by both sexes, a practical choice for a people who spent much of their time outdoors. Footwear was simple, consisting of leather shoes or boots that were tied or laced in place. The overall impression was of clothing that was comfortable and durable, designed for a life spent largely in the open air. The social structure of Celtic society placed great emphasis on the warrior class, and martial prowess was one of the most admired qualities a man could possess. However, this does not mean that Celtic life was dominated by warfare or violence. For the vast majority of people, on most days, life was occupied with the quiet work of farming, crafting, and raising families. The warrior tradition was important for the defense of the community and for settling disputes between tribes, but it existed alongside and was supported by the productive labor of the broader population. The relationship between the warrior class and the farming community was one of mutual dependence, with each providing something essential to the other: religious and spiritual life among the Celtic peoples was closely tied to the natural world. The Celts believed in a realm beyond the visible world, a place where the spirits of the dead and various divine beings resided, and this other world was thought to be accessible at certain times and places. Sacred sites, often located in natural features such as groves of trees, lakes, or springs, were places where offerings were made and rituals were performed. These offerings could include food, animals, or finely crafted objects, deposited in the water or buried in the earth as gifts to the spirits. The relationship between the human world and the spiritual world was not one of fear or dread, but rather of quiet acknowledgement and respect. The festivals that marked the turning of the seasons were among the most important events in the Celtic calendar. The year was divided into cycles that reflected the agricultural rhythms of planting, growing, and harvesting, and each transition was marked by celebration and ritual. Samhain, which fell at the end of autumn, was a time when the boundary between the human world and the other world was believed to be thin, and the spirits of the dead were thought to wander more freely. Imbolc, in early spring, marked the return of longer days and the beginning of the agricultural year. Beltane, in late spring, was associated with the fertility of the land and the health of livestock. And Lugnasad, in late summer, celebrated the first harvest of the year. These festivals brought communities together and provided occasions for feasting, storytelling, and the renewal of social bonds. Music and poetry held a special place in Celtic culture, and the bard was a respected figure within the community. Bardic poetry was not simply entertainment, though it certainly served that purpose as well. It was also a way of preserving history, recording the achievements of important figures, and maintaining the cultural memory of the tribe. Poems were composed and recited at gatherings and festivals, and the skill of the poet was judged by the beauty and cleverness of his verse. Musical instruments, including harps, lyres, and various types of wind instruments, accompanied the recitation of poetry and added to the atmosphere of celebration during festive occasions. Storytelling was equally important, and the tales that were told around the fires on long winter evenings served many purposes. They entertained and amused, but they also taught lessons about how to live, how to treat others, and how to navigate the complexities of social life. Many of these stories involve journeys to the other world, encounters with supernatural beings, and tests of courage and cleverness. They were not meant to frighten or disturb, but rather to engage the imagination and provide a sense of connection to a larger world beyond the boundaries of the village and the hillfort. The Celtic peoples were also skilled traders, and the movement of goods across long distances was an important part of their economic life. Celtic territories were well connected by a network of routes that followed rivers, crossed mountain passes, and linked one settlement to another. Trade goods included metals, particularly tin and copper, as well as textiles, pottery, and food products. Celtic traders traveled widely, and there is evidence of Celtic goods appearing in distant parts of Europe. From the Mediterranean to the Baltic Sea, this movement of goods also brought with it an exchange of ideas, techniques, and cultural influences that enriched Celtic civilization. The relationship between Celtic communities and the Mediterranean world was complex and gradual. Roman merchants and traders made contact with Celtic peoples long before any military campaigns took place, and the flow of goods and ideas between these cultures was well established. Wine, olive oil, and luxury goods from the Roman world found their way into Celtic territories, and Celtic metals and other raw materials flowed in the opposite direction. This peaceful exchange of trade continued for generations, creating a web of economic connections that spanned a vast geographical area. Within Celtic settlements, the organization of daily life followed patterns that were familiar and predictable. People rose with the dawn, and the first tasks of the day were often related to the care of animals and the preparation of the morning meal. Livestock needed to be fed and watered, fires needed to be stoked, and the day's work needed to be planned and begun. For farmers, this meant heading out to the fields or pastures, where the work of cultivation or animal husbandry continued until the light began to fade. For craftsmen, it meant settling into the workshop and taking up the tools of their trade. The rhythm of the day was steady and unhurried, governed by the needs of the land and the household rather than by any external schedule. The education of children in Celtic society was largely informal and practical. Children learned by watching and helping the adults around them, absorbing the skills and knowledge they would need as they grew older. A boy destined to become a farmer learned the ways of the land from his father or other male relatives, while a girl learned the skills of the household from her mother. More specialized knowledge, such as that required for metalwork or weaving, was acquired through apprenticeship or close observation of a skilled practitioner. The Druids, with their long years of training, represented the most formal and extended education available. But this path was open to only a small number of individuals. Health and healing were important concerns in Celtic communities, and a basic knowledge of medicinal plants and treatments was widely shared. Certain individuals, who may have been associated with the Druids or who served as healers in their own right, possessed a deeper knowledge of the natural world and its curative properties. Plants were gathered from the countryside and prepared into remedies for a variety of ailments. Willow bark, for example, was known to reduce pain and fever, and various herbs were used to treat wounds, digestive complaints, and other common conditions. The healer's role was valued within the community, and those who practiced this art were treated with respect. The passing of the seasons brought with it a changing quality of light and atmosphere that shaped the experience of daily life in the Celtic world. In spring, the days grew longer and warmer, and the countryside burst into green as new growth appeared on every hillside and in every valley. The air was fresh and cool, carrying the scent of rain and new earth. Summer brought long, bright days, and the landscape was painted in shades of gold and green as the crops ripened and the grass grew tall. Autumn was a time of mist and golden light, when the leaves turned and the harvest was gathered in. And winter, with its short days and long nights, brought a quiet stillness to the land, broken only by the sound of wind through the bare branches of the trees and the distant call of birds. The Celtic relationship with the land was not one of exploitation, but of careful stewardship. Forests were managed rather than simply cleared, with trees being coppiced and harvested in a way that allowed them to regenerate. Fields were rotated to maintain the fertility of the soil, and common pastures were shared among the families of the community. This approach to land management reflected a deep understanding of the natural world and a recognition that the health of the land was essential to the survival and prosperity of the people who depended upon it. As the centuries passed, Celtic cultures evolved and changed, adapting to new circumstances and influences while maintaining many of the fundamental patterns of daily life that had characterized them for generations. The arrival of Roman power in parts of Celtic territory brought significant changes to some communities, introducing new technologies, administrative systems, and cultural practices. Yet even as these changes took hold, the underlying rhythms of Celtic life, the farming, the crafting, the gathering of communities around fires and festivals, continued in many forms. The Celtic world was not a single moment in time, but a long and gradual unfolding of human experience, spread across centuries and a vast geographical area in the quieter corners of Celtic territory, far from the centers of political power and the roots of major trade. Life continued in much the same way it had for generations. Small farming communities went about their daily work, tending their fields and livestock, building and repairing their homes, and gathering together in the evenings to share food and stories. The hills and forests that surrounded these settlements remained largely unchanged, and the rhythms of the seasons continued to shape the pattern of daily existence. It was in these places, away from the grand narratives of history and the movements of armies, that the true texture of Celtic life could be found in the simple, quiet, and unhurried routines of ordinary people living ordinary days. The mist that often hung over the Celtic lands in the early morning hours would slowly burn away as the sun rose higher, revealing the familiar landscape of hills and fields and woodland that had been home to generations of Celtic people. The dew on the grass caught the light and glittered briefly before disappearing, and the sounds of the waking world, birdsong, the lowing of cattle, the distant murmur of a stream, filled the air with a gentle symphony that required no audience and no occasion. This was simply the way the day began, as it had begun countless times before. In a world that moved at its own pace and answered to no authority, with the turning of the earth and the passage of the seasons, this quiet and unhurried existence spread across the misty highlands and rolling plains of ancient Europe was the reality of Celtic life for centuries. It was not a story of dramatic events or extraordinary achievements, though such things did occur from time to time. It was, rather, a steady and continuous pattern of human activity, shaped by the land, the climate, and the social bonds that held communities together. The Celtic peoples lived, worked, and rested in the landscape they inhabited, and the traces of their presence can still be found today in the place names, the folklore, and the very contours of the countryside they once called home. This simple and enduring reality was the ordinary world of the ancient Celts, and it persisted, quiet and unhurried, for as long as the hills and the forests in the mist remained. The inner life of a Celtic community was shaped not only by the practical demands of survival, but also by a rich and complex web of social customs and traditions that governed the way people interacted with one another. Hospitality, as has already been noted, was one of the most fundamental of these customs, but it was far from the only one. The giving and receiving of gifts was another important aspect of social life, and the generosity of a chief or a wealthy individual was often measured by the quality and frequency of the gifts he bestowed upon others. This tradition of gift-giving served to reinforce social bonds and to establish and maintain the hierarchies that structured Celtic society. Feasting was closely connected to the practice of gift-giving and to the broader social customs of Celtic life. When a chief or prosperous farmer hosted a feast, it was not simply an occasion for eating and drinking, though these were certainly important elements. It was also a social event at which relationships were affirmed, alliances were strengthened, and the status of the host was publicly acknowledged. The quality and quantity of the food served at a feast was a reflection of the host's wealth and generosity, and the guests who attended were expected to show their appreciation through praise and loyalty. Feasts were held at various times throughout the year, including during the major seasonal festivals and on other occasions that called for celebration or commemoration. The preparation of food for a feast was a significant undertaking that involved the labor of many people. Large quantities of grain needed to be ground into flour, and bread needed to be baked in sufficient amounts to feed a large gathering. Meat was roasted on spits over open fires, and stews and soups were prepared in large cauldrons. The cauldron itself was an important symbol in Celtic culture, representing abundance and the capacity to feed and sustain the community. Archaeological finds have revealed large bronze cauldrons of impressive craftsmanship, and these objects appear to have held a place of considerable cultural significance beyond their purely practical function. The making of alcoholic beverages was another important aspect of Celtic food culture. Mead, a drink made from honey and water, was widely consumed and was considered a prestigious beverage, often associated with feasting and celebration. Beer, brewed from grain, was also a common drink, and the brewing process was well understood by Celtic peoples. Wine, which was imported from the Mediterranean world through trade networks, became increasingly popular in some Celtic territories as contact with Romance civilization grew. The consumption of these beverages at feasts and gatherings was an important part of the social rituals that bound Celtic communities together. The physical environment of the Celtic heartlands was characterized by a variety of landscapes, each with its own particular qualities and resources. The highlands of what is now Scotland and northern England were rugged and dramatic, with steep hills, deep glens, and moorlands swept by wind and rain. The lowlands of Gaul, in present-day France, were gentler in character, with broad river valleys, rolling plains, and extensive forests. The Rhine and Danube river valleys in Central Europe provided important corridors for trade and movement, and the communities that settled along these waterways had access to a range of resources and connections that enriched their lives. Rivers played a particularly important role in Celtic life, serving as sources of water, fish, and transportation. Many Celtic settlements were located near rivers or streams, and the movement of goods and people along these waterways was a vital part of the economic and social life of the region. Rivers were also objects of spiritual significance, and offerings were made to the spirits of particular rivers and lakes, as a way of acknowledging their importance and seeking their favor. The relationship between Celtic peoples and their waterways was one of dependence and reverence, and the health of the rivers was closely linked to the prosperity of the communities that depended upon them. The forests of the Celtic world were vast and ancient, stretching across great swaths of northern and central Europe. These were not the managed woodlands of later centuries, but rather dense and largely undisturbed ecosystems, home to a wide variety of plants and animals. The Celtic peoples used the forests carefully, taking what they needed without destroying the resource on which they depended. Timber was harvested for building and for fuel, but the forests were never cleared entirely. The relationship between the Celtic peoples and their forests was one of mutual dependence, and the health of the woodland was a matter of concern for the communities that lived alongside it. Within the forest, the oak tree held a place of particular significance in Celtic culture. The word druid itself is thought by some scholars to be connected to the word for oak, and the oak grove may have served as a sacred space where rituals and ceremonies were conducted. The oak was valued for its timber, its acorns, and the mistletoe that grew upon it, which was believed to have powerful medicinal and spiritual properties. The gathering of mistletoe from the oak tree was a ritual act, performed by the Druids with great care and ceremony, and the plant was used in a variety of religious and healing contexts. The turning of the year in the Celtic world was marked by a series of festivals and observances that gave shape and meaning to the passage of time. Each season brought its own particular tasks and pleasures, and the transition from one to the next was acknowledged and celebrated in ways that reflected the importance of these rhythms to the life of the community. The festivals were not simply religious occasions, though they certainly had a spiritual dimension. They were also social events that brought people together, provided opportunities for trade and courtship, and reinforced the bonds that held the community in place. The celebration of Samhain, which marked the transition from the lighter half of the year to the darker half, was perhaps the most significant of the Celtic festivals. It fell at the end of October or the beginning of November, and it was a time when the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead was believed to be at its thinnest. Fires were lit on hilltops and in settlements, and the community gathered to feast and to honor the memory of those who had passed away. The atmosphere at Samhain was not one of fear or dread, but rather of quiet acknowledgement and of a gentle awareness of the continuity between the living and the dead. Beltane, which fell in late spring, was a festival associated with the fertility of the land and the health of livestock. Fires were lit and cattle were driven between them as a ritual act of purification and protection. The festival was a time of celebration and optimism, marking the beginning of the warmer half of the year and the promise of a good harvest to come. Communities gathered to feast and to enjoy the pleasures of the season, and the atmosphere was one of warmth and renewal. The fields were green and the days were long, and the future seemed bright and full of possibility. The daily rhythms of Celtic life were punctuated by these larger celebrations and observances, but they were also shaped by the smaller, quieter rituals that marked the passage of an ordinary day. The morning fire was lit with care, and the first meal of the day was prepared and shared among the members of the household. The day's work was begun, and it continued, steady and unhurried, until the light began to fade and the evening drew in. The evening meal was shared, and then the household settled into the quiet routines of the nighttime hours, mending, spinning, or simply resting by the fire as the darkness gathered outside and the stars appeared one by one in the sky above. The sound of the wind was a constant presence in the Celtic world, blowing across the highlands and plains with a persistence that shaped the very character of the landscape. On calm days, it was little more than a gentle rustling in the treetops, a soft and barely noticeable accompaniment to the other sounds of the countryside. On stormier days, it could howl and moan around the corners of the roundhouses, rattling the thatch and sending leaves and branches skittering across the ground. Yet even in its strongest form, the wind was a familiar presence, something that the Celtic peoples had lived with for generations and had learned to accept as simply part of the world in which they lived. The quality of the light in the Celtic lands changed with the seasons in ways that profoundly affected the experience of daily life. In summer, the days were long and bright, and the sun hung high in the sky for many hours, flooding the landscape with a warm and golden radiance. The fields and pastures glowed in the afternoon light, and the rivers caught the sun and turned it into 1,000 dancing points of brightness. In winter, the light was pale and thin, arriving late in the morning and departing early in the evening, and the landscape took on a quieter, more subdued character. The mist and low cloud that often accompanied the shorter days added a softness to the world, blurring the edges of the hills and the outlines of the trees, and lending an air of gentle mystery to the familiar countryside. As the years passed and the generations succeeded one another, the Celtic peoples continued to live in the landscape they had inhabited for so long, adapting quietly to the changes that came with time while maintaining the fundamental patterns of daily existence that had defined their world. The hillforts still stood on their prominent heights, the roundhouses still clustered in their settlements, and the fields and forests still stretched out across the countryside in much the same way they had for centuries. The Druids still conducted their rituals and preserved their knowledge. The smiths still worked their forges, and the farmers still tended their crops and livestock through the turning of the seasons. It is easy to quietly imagine such an environment, stretching across the ancient landscape of Europe in a state of calm and unhurried continuity. The Celtic world was not a place of dramatic upheaval or sudden change, but rather a slow and steady unfolding of human life, shaped by the land, the climate, and the customs that had been passed down from one generation to the next. The people who lived within it found meaning and purpose in the rhythms of their daily existence, in the work they did, the communities they belonged to, and the deep and abiding connection they maintained with the natural world around them. This was the Celtic world, quiet and enduring, spread across the misty and verdant landscapes of ancient Europe. It was a world of small settlements and ancient forests, of roundhouses and hillforts, of farmers and craftsmen and storytellers. It was a world that moved at its own pace, answering to the turning of the seasons and the needs of the community rather than to the ambitions of empire or the demands of progress. And it persisted, in one form or another, for centuries, a quiet and continuous thread in the larger tapestry of human history. The ordinary reality of Celtic life, with its simple routines and gentle rhythms, was an enduring and deeply human experience, one that connected the people of this ancient world to the land they called home in ways that were both profound and entirely unremarkable. The Parthian Empire stretched across a vast and varied landscape, from the arid deserts of the east to the fertile plains of Mesopotamia in the west, encompassing a territory that had once formed the eastern reaches of the Persian Empire founded by the Achaemenids. By the time the Parthians rose to power, roughly in the 2nd century BCE, this enormous expanse of land was home to dozens of distinct peoples, each with their own customs, languages, and ways of life. The Parthian rulers governed this diverse territory not through rigid centralization, but through a system of semi-autonomous kingdoms and provinces, each maintaining its own local character while remaining loosely bound to the imperial center. It was within this sprawling and tolerant framework that the ordinary rhythms of daily life unfolded, quiet and continuous. For generation after generation, the landscape of the Parthian world was shaped by the great rivers and desert expanses that defined the geography of Western and Central Asia and Mesopotamia. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers flowed slowly through a land of fertile soil and ancient cities, their waters sustaining agriculture and providing the arteries along which trade and communication moved. Further east, the terrain grew drier and more rugged, with rocky plateaus and barren stretches of sand giving way to scattered oases and river valleys, where settlements clung to the edge of the cultivable land. The climate varied enormously from one region to another, from the oppressive heat of the lowland plains in summer to the biting cold of the highland passes in winter. And the people who lived within this territory adapted their ways of life to the particular conditions of the place they called home. Cities were the centers of political and economic life in the Parthian Empire, and several of them grew to considerable size and importance during the centuries of Parthian rule. Ctesiphon, situated on the western bank of the Tigris, served as the imperial capital for much of the empire's existence, and it was here that the Parthian kings held court and conducted the affairs of state. The city was a place of remarkable activity, where merchants from distant lands mingled with local craftsmen and farmers, where the sounds of many languages could be heard in the markets, and where the architecture of the empire's diverse cultural traditions blended into a landscape of palaces, temples, and busy streets. Yet even in Ctesiphon, beneath the grandeur of the royal court, ordinary life continued in its usual quiet patterns, with families rising in the morning to tend to their daily work and gathering in the evening to share meals and conversation. The smaller cities and towns of the Parthian Empire were more modest in scale, but no less important to the fabric of daily life. Along the great trade routes that connected the empire to the wider world, caravanserais and market towns served as stopping points for travelers and as gathering places for local communities. These settlements were places where goods were bought and sold, where news was exchanged, and where the rhythms of commerce and social life intersected. The architecture of these towns reflected the practical needs of their inhabitants, with sturdy walls built to withstand the harsh climate, and courtyards and shaded spaces designed to provide relief from the intense heat of the summer sun. The Silk Road, as it would later come to be known, passed through the heart of the Parthian Empire, and the flow of goods along this ancient network of trade routes was one of the most significant aspects of Parthian economic and cultural life. Silk from China moved westward along these routes, carried by merchants on the backs of camels through the mountain passes and desert crossings that connected east and west. In return, goods from the Roman world, including glass, textiles, and luxury items, traveled eastward along the same paths. The Parthians controlled much of this trade, and the tolls and duties levied on goods passing through their territory provided a substantial source of revenue for the empire. The movement of merchants and their caravans was a constant presence along these routes, and the caravanserais where they rested and resupplied were places of considerable activity and exchange. Daily life for the majority of the Parthian population was centered on agriculture, and the fertile plains of Mesopotamia and the river valleys of the east supported a large and largely rural population. Farmers cultivated wheat, barley, and other grain crops in the irrigated fields that surrounded the major settlements, and these staples formed the foundation of the diet for most people. Date palms grew abundantly in the lowlands, and their fruit was an important food source as well as a valuable trade commodity. Orchards of pomegranates, figs, and other fruits added variety to the agricultural landscape. And the irrigation systems that sustained this farming were among the most sophisticated in the ancient world. Drawing water from the great rivers and distributing it across the land through networks of channels and ditches, the irrigation of the Mesopotamian plains was a task that required considerable organization and cooperation among the farming communities. Water rights were carefully managed, and the maintenance of the irrigation channels was a shared responsibility that fell upon the local population. The work of keeping these channels clear and functional was continuous, particularly during the dry summer months when the flow of water was reduced and the demand for irrigation was at its greatest. The sound of water moving through these channels was a constant presence in the agricultural landscape, and the sight of the irrigated fields stretching out across the plain, green and productive in contrast to the dry and barren land beyond, was one of the most familiar features of daily life in rural Parthia. The homes of ordinary Parthian people varied in style and construction depending on the region in which they lived and the materials available locally. In Mesopotamia, where timber was scarce but clay was abundant, houses were built primarily from mud brick, a material that provided excellent insulation against both the heat of summer and the cold of winter nights. These structures were typically rectangular in shape, with thick walls and flat roofs, arranged around a central courtyard that provided a private and sheltered space for the family. The courtyard was often shaded by a vine or a date palm, and it served as the heart of the household, where cooking, washing, and other daily activities took place. In the cooler months, the family might gather in the courtyard in the evening, enjoying the mild air and the quiet sounds of the neighborhood, settling down for the night. In the more mountainous regions to the east, houses were constructed from stone where it was available, or from a combination of stone and mud brick. These structures were often built into the hillside or arranged in clusters that took advantage of the natural terrain for shelter and defense. The roofs were sometimes flat, sometimes slightly pitched to shed the heavier snowfall of the highland winters, and the overall impression was of solid, practical buildings designed to withstand the harsh conditions of the environment. Inside, the rooms were modest in size, but kept warm by fires or small heating systems, and the walls were sometimes plastered and decorated with simple, geometric patterns or images drawn from the natural world. Food preparation was a central activity in every Parthian household, and the diet of most people reflected the agricultural abundance of the region. Bread, made from wheat or barley flour, was a staple of every meal, baked in clay ovens that were found in most homes or in communal ovens shared among neighbors. Lentils, chickpeas, and other legumes provided an important source of protein, and these were often cooked into thick soups or stews that were seasoned with local herbs and spices. The spice trade that would later become so significant in the commerce of the ancient world was already developing during the Parthian period, and the use of cinnamon, pepper, and other flavoring agents began to enrich the cuisine of the empire's various regions. Meat was consumed regularly in Parthian households, though the type and quantity varied with the region and the prosperity of the family. Sheep and goats were the most common livestock, raised for their meat, milk, wool, and hides, and their slaughter for a meal was often an occasion for gathering and celebration. Cattle were kept in the more fertile plains, and their milk was used to produce butter and cheese, which were important components of the daily diet. Fish, caught in the rivers and marshes of Mesopotamia, provided another source of protein, particularly for communities situated along the waterways. The preparation of these foods was done with care and skill, and the knowledge of cooking techniques and recipes was passed from one generation to the next as a matter of course. The social structure of Parthian society was characterized by a broad range of occupations and social positions. from the aristocratic families who controlled the great estates and held political power to the farmers, craftsmen, and laborers who formed the backbone of the economy. The Parthian system of governance allowed considerable autonomy to local rulers and landowners, and this meant that the experience of daily life could vary significantly from one region to another. In some areas, the local nobility exercised a degree of control over the lives of the people that was comparable to the feudal arrangements of later European societies, while in others, particularly in the urban centers along the trade routes, a more fluid social structure prevailed, with merchants and craftsmen enjoying a degree of independence and prosperity that was not available to the rural population. Cities of the Parthian Empire were places of considerable cultural and intellectual activity, and the diversity of peoples and traditions that came together in these urban centers created an environment of remarkable openness and exchange. Scholars and philosophers from Greek, Persian, and other traditions mingled in the cities, and the libraries and academies that flourished under Parthian patronage preserved and transmitted knowledge from a wide range of cultural sources. The Greek language, which had been established as a lingua franca of the Eastern Mediterranean and Western Asia during the Hellenistic period, continued to be used alongside Persian and Aramaic, and the intermingling of these linguistic and cultural traditions gave the Parthian world a cosmopolitan character that was unusual for the ancient world. Religion in the Parthian Empire was diverse and tolerant, reflecting the empire's policy of allowing local customs and beliefs to continue alongside the official state religion. Zoroastrianism, the ancient religion of Persia, was practiced by many of the empire's inhabitants, particularly in the eastern regions where Persian cultural traditions remained strong. The Zoroastrian faith, with its emphasis on the struggle between good and evil, its sacred fires, and its elaborate rituals marking the passage of the seasons and the events of life, provided a framework of meaning and purpose for many Parthian people. Zoroastrian temples, with their eternal flames burning in carefully tended sanctuaries, were features of the landscape in many parts of the empire, and the priests who tended these fires and conducted the rituals of the faith were respected figures within their communities. Alongside Zoroastrianism, other religious traditions flourished in the Parthian Empire. Buddhism was making its way westward from India along the trade routes, and its teachings found receptive audiences in some of the empire's eastern territories. Judaism was practiced by communities scattered across Mesopotamia and other regions, and the synagogues and religious schools that served these communities were centers of learning and spiritual life. Greek religions, including the worship of Zeus, Apollo, and other Olympian deities, continued to be practiced in some of the empire's more Hellenistic cities, and the temples and sanctuaries devoted to these gods were familiar features of the urban landscape. This multiplicity of religious traditions coexisted with a degree of mutual tolerance that was remarkable by the standards of the ancient world, and the daily lives of people of different faiths intersected and overlapped in the markets, the workshops, and the neighborhoods of the empire's cities. The working of metals was an important craft in Parthian society, and the smiths and metalworkers who practiced this art produced a wide range of objects for both practical and decorative purposes. Gold and silver, obtained through trade and mining, were worked into jewelry, vessels, and other luxury items that reflected the wealth and status of their owners. Bronze was used for weapons, tools, and ceremonial objects, and the quality of Parthian metalwork was high, with craftsmen demonstrating a skilled understanding of the properties of different metals and the techniques required to shape them. The decorative style of Parthian metalwork often blended Greek, Persian, and other artistic traditions, creating objects of considerable beauty and cultural significance. Textile production was another significant craft in the Parthian world, and the fabrics produced in the empire's workshops were valued both locally and in the wider trade networks that connected Parthia to the Mediterranean and to Central Asia. Wool, obtained from the sheep that grazed on the pastures of the empire's highland regions, was spun and woven into cloth of varying quality and fineness. Silk, imported from China along the Silk Road, was worked into luxury textiles that were prized by the wealthy and were also an important trade commodity. The weavers who produced these fabrics worked on looms set up in their homes or in specialized workshops, and the rhythmic sound of the shuttle and the careful attention required to produce cloth of good quality made weaving a skill that demanded patience and expertise. The education of children in Parthian society followed patterns that were largely informal and practical, with most young people learning the skills they would need in life by observing and assisting the adults around them. Boys destined to work as farmers learned the ways of the land from their fathers, while those who showed an aptitude for craft or trade might be apprenticed to a skilled practitioner of the relevant art. In the cities, where literacy was more common, some children attended schools where they learned to read and write in one or more of the languages of the empire. The more formal education available in the academies and schools of the Parthian cities was largely restricted to the sons of the wealthy and the privileged. But the knowledge and learning that was cultivated in these institutions contributed to the intellectual life of the empire as a eye of Ada. Hold out the health and well-being of the population were matters of concern in Parthian communities, and a range of healing practices were employed to treat illness and injury. Some of these practices were rooted in the ancient Persian and Mesopotamian traditions of medicine, which drew on a knowledge of medicinal plants and herbal remedies that had been accumulated over many generations. Others reflected the influence of Greek medical science, which had made significant advances in the understanding of the human body and the treatment of disease during the Hellenistic period. Healers and physicians practiced their art in both urban and rural settings, and the knowledge of medicinal plants and treatments was shared among the population to varying degrees, with some individuals possessing a deeper expertise than others. The passage of the seasons in the Parthian lands brought with it a rhythm of agricultural activity and social life that shaped the experience of daily existence for most people. The spring rains, when they came, revived the dried and cracked earth of the Mesopotamian plain and filled the irrigation channels with fresh water, signaling the beginning of the planting season and the renewal of agricultural work. The summer months were hot and demanding, with the sun beating down on the fields and the labor of tending crops and livestock continuing from dawn to dusk. Autumn brought the harvest, when the grain was gathered and stored for the coming winter, and the mood of the communities turned to one of gratitude and celebration. Winter, with its shorter days and cooler temperatures, was a time for rest and reflection, when the pace of work slowed and the evenings lengthened, providing time for storytelling, conversation, and the quiet enjoyment of family life. The night sky over the Parthian lands was clear and brilliant, unmarred by the light pollution that would in later centuries obscure the stars in the populated regions of the world. On calm evenings, the Milky Way stretched across the darkness in a broad and luminous band, and the planets moved slowly among the fixed stars in their ancient courses. The study of the heavens was an important intellectual tradition in Mesopotamia, where astronomers have been observing and recording the movements of celestial bodies for centuries before the Parthian period. This knowledge of the stars and the planets was not merely academic, but had practical applications in the measurement of time, the prediction of seasons, and the navigation of the desert and mountain routes along which the caravans of the Silk Road traveled. On quiet nights, ordinary people looked up at the same sky that had inspired generations of astronomers, and saw in it a source of wonder and a reminder of their place in the larger order of the world. The markets and bazaars of the Parthian cities were places of extraordinary activity and diversity, where goods from every corner of the known world were bought and sold, and where the encounters between merchants of different cultures and backgrounds created an atmosphere of cosmopolitan exchange. The scent of spices from the east mingled with the smell of leather and wool and freshly baked bread, and the sounds of haggling and conversation in a dozen languages filled the air from morning to evening. The merchants who frequented these markets were often men of considerable wealth and worldly experience, who had traveled far from their homes and had seen something of the wider world beyond the borders of the empire. Their stories and observations, shared in the tea-houses and caravanserais along the trade routes, added to the flow of information and ideas that connected the Parthian Empire to the civilizations that lay beyond its borders. The caravanserais that lined the great trade routes of the Parthian Empire were more than simple resting places for weary travelers. They were establishments of considerable comfort and importance, where merchants could store their goods, water and feed their camels, and enjoy a meal and a night's rest in relative safety. The architecture of these buildings reflected their function, with large courtyards open to the sky surrounded by rooms and stables, and walls thick enough to provide protection from both the elements and any threat of banditry. The caravanserai was a place where cultures met and mingled, where a Persian merchant might share a meal with a Greek trader or a Chinese silk dealer, and where the exchange of goods was accompanied by an exchange of stories, customs, and ideas that enriched the lives of all who participated. The relationship between the Parthian Empire and the Roman Empire to the west was one of the most significant diplomatic and commercial connections of the ancient world. Roman and Parthian territories did not share a border directly, but the kingdoms and territories that lay between them served as intermediaries in both trade and diplomacy. Roman merchants sought access to the luxury goods of the East, particularly silk and spices, and the Parthians were keen to maintain the flow of trade that brought wealth and prestige to their empire. The diplomatic exchanges between Rome and Parthia were conducted with a degree of formality and mutual respect, and the two empires maintained a complex but largely peaceful relationship for much of the Parthian period. The arts and crafts of the Parthian Empire reflected the diversity of cultural traditions that coexisted within its borders. Sculpture, painting, and architectural decoration drew on Greek, Persian, and other artistic traditions, and the resulting works often blended elements from these different sources into compositions of considerable originality and beauty. The Parthian style of art, with its characteristic frontality and its elaborate decorative detail, became one of the most distinctive artistic traditions of the ancient world, and its influence can be seen in the art and architecture of many of the regions that were once part of the Parthian Empire. The craftsmen who produced these works were skilled artisans who had mastered the techniques of their respective trades through years of training and practice, and the objects they created were valued both for their aesthetic qualities and for the cultural significance they carried. Music and poetry were important aspects of cultural life in the Parthian Empire, and the traditions of oral storytelling that had been maintained for generations in the various regions of the empire continued to flourish under Parthian rule. Persian epic poetry, with its tales of heroes and kings, was recited at gatherings and feasts, and the skill of the storyteller was valued and rewarded. Greek literary traditions, including drama and lyric poetry, were also practiced in the more Hellenistic cities of the empire, and the libraries that were maintained in some of these urban centers preserved texts from a wide range of literary and intellectual traditions. The cultural life of the Parthian Empire was thus a rich and varied tapestry, reflecting the many different threads of tradition and influence that were woven together within its borders. The evening hours in a Parthian household were a time of quiet and gentle relaxation, when the work of the day was done and the family gathered together in the warmth of the home. The fire burned low in the hearth, and the air carried the lingering smell of the evening meal and the faint scent of incense or aromatic wood that might have been burned during the day. Children listened as their parents or grandparents told stories of distant lands and legendary figures, their voices soft and unhurried in the dimness of the room. Outside, the sounds of the neighborhood settling down for the night drifted in through the open doorway. The occasional bark of a dog, the murmur of a neighbor's conversation, the gentle rustling of the wind against the walls of the mud brick houses. The world beyond the household was vast and busy, connected by the great trade routes to civilization stretching from China to Rome. But within the walls of this modest home, the pace of life was slow and the concerns were simple and immediate. As the centuries of Parthian rule continued, the empire maintained its position as one of the great powers of the ancient world, a bridge between East and West along which goods, ideas, and cultural influences flowed in both directions. The ordinary people who lived within its borders went about their daily lives in much the same way that their ancestors had done, farming the land, practicing their crafts, raising their families, and participating in the social and religious life of their communities. The grand affairs of empire, the diplomacy and the warfare and the political maneuvering that occupied the attention of kings and nobles, were distant from the experience of most people, who knew them only as rumors and stories, filtering down from the centers of power. For these ordinary inhabitants of the Parthian world, life was defined not by the rise and fall of empires, but by the quiet and continuous rhythms of daily existence. The work, the rest, the meals shared with family, and the slow passage of the seasons across the landscape they called home. The dust that rose from the roads and tracks of the Parthian Empire on a dry summer day would settle again by evening, and the landscape would return to its usual stillness as the sun sank below the horizon and the temperature began to fall. The stars appeared one by one in the darkening sky, and the sounds of the night, the calling of birds, the distant howl of a jackal, the soft stirring of the wind across the plain, replaced the bustle and activity of the daylight hours. This was the world of the Parthian Empire in its quieter moments, a world that stretched from the marshes of Mesopotamia to the mountain passes of Central Asia, and that was home to millions of people living their lives in the shadow of one of the great empires of antiquity. It was a world of remarkable diversity and cultural richness, but it was also, for most of its inhabitants, a world of simple and enduring routines, of work and rest and the steady turning of the seasons, that persisted quietly and continuously for as long as the empire itself endured. The water of the Tigris flowed quietly through the heart of Mesopotamia, its surface catching the light of the morning sun and turning it into a gentle shimmer that stretched from bank to bank. Along the riverfront, fishermen set out their nets in the early hours, working with practiced ease in the shallow waters where the fish gathered in the cool of the morning. The sound of the water lapping against the clay banks and the occasional splash of a fish breaking the surface were familiar sounds to anyone who lived near the river, and they provided a backdrop to the daily activities of the communities that depended upon it for their sustenance and their livelihood. The craft of pottery was widespread throughout the Parthian Empire, and the clay vessels produced by local potters served a wide range of practical and ceremonial purposes. Water jars, cooking pots, storage vessels, and dishes of various sizes and shapes were produced in quantities that reflected the daily needs of the population, and the techniques of their manufacture were well understood by the craftsmen who practiced this ancient art. Some potters produced vessels of purely functional design, sturdy and utilitarian, intended for everyday use in the home. Others created more elaborate pieces, decorated with painted designs or glazed surfaces that reflected the aesthetic sensibilities of the region and the period. The kilns in which these vessels were fired burned hot and steady, and the work of the potter, from the shaping of the clay on the wheel to the firing and the decoration of the finished piece, required skill and patience that could only be acquired through years of practice. The gardens and parks that surrounded the wealthier homes and palaces of the Parthian world were carefully tended spaces where water was used to create an environment of coolness and beauty in the midst of the dry and often harsh landscape. The word paradise itself is thought to derive from the old Persian word for an enclosed garden, and the tradition of creating these sheltered green spaces was one of the most enduring and characteristic features of Persian culture. In these gardens, fruit trees provided shade and sustenance, while flowering plants and herbs added color and fragrance to the air. The sound of water flowing through channels or splashing in fountains created an atmosphere of tranquility and ease, and the gardens served as places of rest and reflection for those who had access to them. For the broader population, the sight of these gardens, visible from the roads and pathways that led past the great estates, offered a glimpse of a different kind of life, one defined by leisure and beauty rather than by the relentless demands of daily labor. The transportation of goods across the vast distances of the Parthian Empire relied heavily on the camel, an animal uniquely suited to the harsh conditions of the desert and mountain routes that connected one part of the empire to another. Camels could travel for days without water, carrying heavy loads across terrain that would defeat horses and other beasts of burden, and their ability to navigate the shifting sands and rocky passes of the desert made them indispensable to the merchants and traders who moved goods along the Silk Road. The care and management of camel caravans was a specialized skill, and the caravan leaders who organized and directed these long journeys were experienced and resourceful individuals who understood the rhythms of the road and the demands of the desert. The slow, steady pace of the camels as they moved across the landscape, their footsteps leaving a trail of impressions in the sand or dust, was one of the most characteristic sights of travel in the Parthian world. The role of women in Parthian society varied depending on the region, the social class, and the particular customs of the community in which they lived. In the more conservative rural areas, women's lives were largely confined to the domestic sphere, where they managed the household, prepared food, raised children, and produced textiles and other goods needed by the family. In the urban centers, particularly among the more cosmopolitan populations of the trading cities along the Silk Road, women enjoyed somewhat greater freedom and participation in public life. Though the extent of this varied considerably, the management of a household in the ancient world was no small task, requiring a wide range of skills and knowledge, from the preparation of food and the maintenance of the home to the education of children and the management of family finances. The seasons in the highland regions of the Eastern Parthian Empire brought with them dramatic changes in the character of the landscape and the rhythm of daily life. In summer, the highland pastures were green and lush, providing rich grazing for the sheep and goats that formed the basis of the pastoral economy of these regions. The shepherds who tended these flocks moved with them across the hillsides, following the ancient routes that led to the best grazing grounds, and their knowledge of the terrain and the habits of their animals was accumulated over a lifetime of experience. In winter, the highlands were covered with snow, and the shepherds and their flocks descended to the lower valleys, where the climate was milder and grazing could still be found. This annual migration was one of the defining rhythms of life in the highland regions, and it shaped the social customs, the economic activities, and the very identity of the communities that practiced it. The night in the Parthian lands was a time of quiet and stillness, when the activities of the day gave way to rest and reflection. The stars burned bright and cold in the clear sky above, and the air cooled rapidly as the sun disappeared below the horizon, particularly in the highland regions where the nights could be bitterly cold. Inside the homes of the empire's inhabitants, the fires were stoked and the family gathered close, seeking warmth and comfort in the darkness. The stories that were told in these quiet hours spoke of heroes and monsters, of journeys to distant lands, and of the gods and spirits that were believed to inhabit the world alongside ordinary people. These tales, passed from one generation to the next through the medium of spoken word, were a vital part of the cultural life of the Parthian world, preserving the memory and the wisdom of the past and transmitting it to the future, in a form that required no written text and no formal education. To receive and to understand, the empire that the Parthians had built was, in many respects, a testament to the power of tolerance and pragmatism in the governance of a diverse and sprawling territory. Unlike the more centralized empires that had preceded and would succeed, the Parthian state allowed a considerable degree of local autonomy, permitting the various peoples and communities within its borders to maintain their own customs, religions, and ways of life. This approach to governance was not born of any grand philosophical principle, but rather of a practical recognition that the empire's territory was too vast and too diverse to be effectively controlled through a single administrative system. The result was a political structure that was sometimes criticized for its looseness and its lack of coherent central authority, but that also created the conditions for a remarkable degree of cultural exchange and intellectual vitality within its borders, as the decades and centuries of Parthian rule continued. The empire maintained its position as a great power of the ancient world, a crossroads of trade and culture that connected the civilizations of East and West. The ordinary rhythms of daily life within its borders continued largely unchanged, shaped by the demands of agriculture, the customs of local communities, and the slow passage of the seasons across the varied landscapes of Western and Central Asia. The great events of imperial history, the wars and the diplomatic negotiations and the political intrigues that occupied the attention of kings and nobles, were distant from the experience of most people, who knew them only as distant echoes filtering down from the centers of power. For the farmers and craftsmen and merchants who made up the bulk of the population, life was defined by simpler and more immediate concerns: the tending of crops and livestock, the care of family and community, and the quiet enjoyment of the small pleasures that each day brought. This was the reality of life in the Parthian Empire, quiet and continuous and unhurried, spread across a vast landscape and sustained by the labor and the ingenuity of millions of ordinary people, who lived and worked and rested in the shadow of one of the great empires of antiquity. The Sassanid Empire rose to power in the 3rd century CE, replacing the Parthian dynasty that had ruled the region for nearly 5 centuries. And under Sassanid rule, the ancient lands of Persia experienced a period of cultural, religious, and administrative renewal that would shape the character of the region for generations to come. The empire stretched from the borders of the Roman world in the west to the mountains of Central Asia in the east, encompassing a territory of extraordinary geographical diversity, from the fertile river valleys of Mesopotamia to the high plateaus of the Iranian highlands and the arid expanses of the eastern deserts. It was an empire that prided itself on its Persian heritage, drawing upon the traditions and symbols of the ancient Achaemenid kings to legitimize its rule, and it sought to impose a greater degree of order and coherence upon its vast territory than the more loosely governed Parthian state had managed to achieve. The landscape of the Sassanid world was characterized by the same great contrasts that had shaped a region for millennia: the fertile and irrigated plains set against the dry and barren uplands, The ancient cities nestled along the riverbanks and the scattered settlements of the highland and desert regions. The Tigris and Euphrates continued to flow through Mesopotamia as they had done for thousands of years, sustaining the agriculture and the settlement patterns of the lowland plains, while the rivers and streams of the Iranian plateau fed the oases and valleys where smaller communities had established themselves in the shadow of the mountains. The climate of the empire varied enormously from one region to another, and the people who lived within its borders had adapted their ways of life to the particular conditions of the place they called home, developing customs and practices suited to the demands of their local environment. Under the Sassanid kings, the empire was administered through a more centralized system than had existed under their Parthian predecessors. Provincial governors, appointed by the king and answerable to the central court, oversaw the affairs of the various regions of the empire, and a network of officials and scribes maintained records and collected taxes on behalf of the state. This administrative apparatus was supported by a system of law and governance that drew upon both Persian and Zoroastrian traditions, and it sought to bring a greater degree of uniformity and order to the empire's diverse territories. Yet even within this more structured system, the daily lives of ordinary people continued to be shaped primarily by the rhythms of local life, by the demands of agriculture and craft, by the customs of their communities, and by the passage of the seasons across the landscape they inhabited. Zoroastrianism, the ancient religion of Persia, occupied a central and privileged position within Sassanid society, and the Sassanid kings actively promoted the faith as a means of unifying the empire and legitimizing their rule. The Zoroastrian priesthood, known as the Magi, enjoyed considerable influence and authority within Sassanid society, serving not only as religious leaders and conductors of ritual, but also as advisors to the king and guardians of the empire's cultural and intellectual traditions. The sacred fires that burned in the Zoroastrian temples were tended with great care and ceremony, and these temples were among the most prominent and impressive structures in the empire's cities and towns. The faith itself, with its teachings on the cosmic struggle between good and evil, its elaborate ritual calendar, and its emphasis on righteous conduct and proper observance, provided a framework of meaning and moral purpose for the fight lives of the empire's inhabitants. The Zoroastrian temples that dotted the landscape of the Sassanid Empire were places of both religious and social importance, serving as centers of community life as well as venues for the conduct of sacred rituals. The eternal fire that burned at the heart of each temple was believed to be a manifestation of the divine presence, and its maintenance was a solemn duty that fell upon the priests who served the temple. The temples were often constructed of fine stone or brick, with elaborate decorative programs that reflected the wealth and piety of their patrons, and they were surrounded by gardens and open spaces that provided a setting of calm and beauty. On the major festivals of the Zoroastrian calendar, the temples became focal points of communal celebration, and the communities that gathered around them came together to feast, to pray, and to renew their commitment to the teachings of the faith. The daily lives of most Sassanid people were shaped by the rhythms of agriculture, much as they had been for generations before. The fertile plains of Mesopotamia and the river valleys of western Iran supported a large population of farmers who cultivated wheat, barley, and other grain crops in the irrigated fields that stretched across the lowland terrain. The irrigation systems that sustained this agriculture were among the most sophisticated and extensive in the ancient world, drawing water from the great rivers and distributing it across vast areas of otherwise dry and unproductive land. The maintenance of these systems was a shared responsibility that required cooperation and organization among the farming communities, and the work of keeping the channels clear and the water flowing was a constant and essential task throughout the Agricultural year. The homes of ordinary Sassanid people were built to suit the climate and the available materials of the regions in which they lived. In the lowlands of Mesopotamia and western Iran, where the summers were hot and dry, houses were constructed primarily from mud brick, with thick walls and flat or slightly domed roofs designed to retain the coolness of the night and to provide shade during the hottest hours of the day. These structures were arranged around central courtyards, shaded by trees or vines, where the family conducted much of its daily business. The courtyard was the heart of the household, a private and sheltered space where cooking was done, where children played, and where the family gathered in the evening to share a meal and enjoy the cooling air as the sun began to set. In the highland regions of the Iranian plateau, where the winters could be harsh and the summers brief and intense, houses were built from stone or from a combination of stone and mud brick, with thicker walls and more enclosed designs suited to the colder climate. These structures hugged the contours of the hillside or were arranged in compact clusters that took advantage of the natural terrain for shelter and protection from the wind. Inside, the rooms were kept warm by fires or by simple heating systems, and the walls were sometimes plastered and decorated with painted designs, or images drawn from the natural world or from the traditions of Zoroastrian art and symbolism. Food and sustenance were central concerns for all Sassanid communities, and the diet of most people reflected the agricultural products of their region. Bread, baked from wheat or barley flour in clay ovens, was a staple of every meal, and its preparation was one of the most fundamental and daily tasks of the household. Along with bread, lentils, chickpeas, and other legumes provided an important source of protein, and these were often prepared as thick soups or stews seasoned with local herbs and spices. The use of spices and condiments in Sassanid cooking was more elaborate than in many other parts of the ancient world, reflecting both the empire's position along the great trade routes and the traditions of Persian cuisine that had developed over many centuries. Meat, particularly that of sheep and goats, was consumed regularly in Sassanid households, though the quantity varied with the prosperity of the family and the season of the year. These animals were central to the pastoral economy of the highland and steppe regions, providing not only meat but also milk, wool, and hides, and their care and management was a fundamental activity for the communities that raised them. Dairy products, including yogurt, butter, and various types of cheese, were important components of the diet, particularly during the summer months when the animals were producing milk in abundance. Fish, obtained from the rivers and marshes of Mesopotamia and from the waters of the Persian Gulf, supplemented the diet of communities situated along the waterways and the coast. The Sassanid Empire was a major participant in the long-distance trade networks that connected the ancient world, and the flow of goods through its territory was an important source of wealth and cultural influence. The empire's position between the Roman world to the west and China to the east placed it at the heart of the Silk Road, and the merchants and traders who passed through Sassanid territory carried with them not only goods but also ideas, technologies, and cultural influences that enriched the life of the empire. Silk from China, spices from India and Southeast Asia, and luxury goods from the Roman world all passed through the empire's borders, and in return, Sassanid merchants exported textiles, metalwork, and other products to the wider world. The cities of the Sassanid Empire were places of considerable size and activity, and several of them grew to become among the largest and most important urban centers of the ancient world. Ctesiphon, the imperial capital, situated on the banks of the Tigris in Mesopotamia, was a city of remarkable scale and grandeur, with a population that may have reached several 100,000 at its height. The great arch of the royal palace, known as the Tat Khosra, was one of the most impressive architectural achievements of the ancient world, and it stood as a symbol of the power and ambition of the Sassanid kings. Yet beneath the grandeur of the royal court and the monumental architecture of the capital, ordinary life continued in its usual quiet rhythms, with families rising in the morning to tend to their daily work and gathering in the evening to share meals and conversation in the warmth of their homes. The smaller cities and towns of the empire served as centers of trade, craft production, and local administration, and their streets and markets were places of considerable activity and exchange. The bazaars that were found in most Sassanid towns were open-air or covered markets, where merchants displayed their wares and where the daily business of buying and selling goods took place. The sounds of commerce, the calls of vendors, the clink of coins, and the murmur of conversation filled the air from morning to evening, and the scent of spices and fresh bread mingled with the smell of leather and wool and the dust of the streets. These markets were not only places of economic activity, but also social spaces where people gathered, exchanged news, and conducted the informal business of community life. The craft traditions of the Sassanid Empire were highly developed and produced objects of remarkable quality and beauty. Metalwork, particularly in gold and silver, reached a high level of refinement under Sassanid patronage, and the vessels, jewelry, and decorative objects produced by Sassanid craftsmen were prized throughout the known world. The decorative style of Sassanid metalwork, with its elaborate medallions, its flowing floral and animal motifs, and its intricate geometric patterns, became one of the most influential artistic traditions of the period, and its influence can be traced in the art and decorative arts of many subsequent cultures. The silversmiths and goldsmiths who produced these works were skilled artisans who had mastered the techniques of their craft through years of training and practice, and their work represented the highest achievement of the decorative arts in the Sassanid world. Textile production was another area in which Sassanid craftsmanship excelled, and the silks and other fabrics produced in the empire's workshops were among the most valued luxury goods of the ancient world. The Sassanid Empire had established its own silk production, breaking the monopoly that China had long held on this precious material. And the silks produced in Sassanid workshops were distinguished by their rich colors, their elaborate patterns, and the fineness of their weave. These textiles were used for the clothing of the wealthy and the powerful, for the decoration of interiors, and as gifts and trade goods that circulated throughout the known world. The weavers who produced these fabrics worked with great skill and patience, spending long hours at the loom to create textiles of exceptional quality and beauty. The education of children in Sassanid society was shaped by the social class and the aspirations of the family. For the majority of the population, education was informal and practical, with children learning the skills they would need in life by observing and assisting the adults around them. A boy destined to work as a farmer learned the ways of the land from his father, while a girl learned the management of the household from her mother. Those who showed an aptitude for craft or trade might be apprenticed to a skilled practitioner, learning the techniques of their chosen profession through close observation and hands-on experience. More formal education was available in the schools and academies that were maintained in the empire's cities, where students learned to read and write in the Middle Persian script that was the official language of the Sassanid state, as well as in other languages and intellectual traditions. The Zoroastrian priesthood played an important role in the intellectual and educational life of the Sassanid Empire, and the training of young men for the priesthood was one of the most intensive and extended forms of education available. Students destined for the priesthood spent many years in study, memorizing the sacred texts and rituals of the Zoroastrian faith and learning the theological and philosophical traditions that underpinned it. This training produced a class of highly educated individuals who served not only as religious leaders, but also as advisors to the state, and as custodians of the empire's cultural and intellectual heritage. The knowledge that was preserved and transmitted through the Zoroastrian priesthood included not only religious teachings, but also traditions of learning in other fields, including medicine, astronomy, and philosophy. Health and healing were important concerns in Sassanid communities, and the empire developed a tradition of medical practice that drew upon both the ancient Persian and Mesopotamian traditions of medicine and the more systematic approaches that had been developed by Greek physicians during the Hellenistic period. Hospitals and healing establishments were maintained in some of the empire's cities, and the physicians who practiced in these institutions were learned individuals who had studied the art of medicine over many years. The knowledge of medicinal plants and herbal remedies was widely shared among the population, and many households possessed a basic understanding of the treatments that could be applied to common ailments. The healers who practiced in rural communities drew upon this shared knowledge as well as upon their own experience and observation, and their role within the community was valued and respected. The passage of the seasons in the Sassanid lands brought with it a rhythm of activity and rest that shaped the experience of daily life for most people. The spring, when the rains returned to the Iranian plateau and the rivers swelled with snowmelt from the mountains, was a time of renewal and preparation, when the fields were plowed and the seeds were sown and the work of the agricultural year began in earnest. The summer months were hot and demanding, particularly in the lowland plains of Mesopotamia, where the sun beat down with an intensity that made outdoor work in the middle of the day a torment. The farmers and laborers who worked in these conditions rose early in the morning and worked through the cooler hours of the dawn and the late afternoon, resting during the hottest part of the day in the shade of the mud brick houses or beneath the canopy of date palms. Autumn brought the harvest, when the grain was gathered and stored for the coming winter, and the mood of the communities turned to one of gratitude and celebration. The Sassanid calendar included a number of festivals and observances that marked the turning of the seasons, and these occasions provided opportunities for feasting, socializing, and the renewal of community bonds. The most significant of these festivals was Nowruz, the Persian New Year, which fell at the spring equinox and was celebrated with elaborate rituals and festivities that had their roots in the ancient traditions of Persian culture. Nowruz was a time of joy and renewal, when the tables were spread with food and drink, fires were lit, and the community gathered to celebrate the return of spring and the promise of a new agricultural year. The winter months in the Sassanid lands were a time of relative rest and quiet, when the pace of agricultural work slowed and the evenings lengthened, providing time for the indoor activities that occupied much of the population during the darker months. Weaving, spinning, and other textile work continued throughout the year, but intensified during the winter, when the hours of daylight were short and the warmth of the household fire made indoor work particularly inviting. Storytelling was another important activity of the winter evenings, and the tales that were told around the fire spoke of heroes and kings, of journeys to distant lands, and of the great struggles between good and evil that were central to the teachings of the Zoroastrian faith. These stories, passed from one generation to the next through the medium of spoken word, preserved the cultural memory of the empire and provided entertainment and instruction for the listeners who gathered to hear them. The night sky over the Sassanid lands was clear and brilliant, and the study of the heavens was an important intellectual tradition that had been maintained for centuries in the region. The astronomers of the Sassanid Empire built upon the astronomical knowledge that had been accumulated by their predecessors in Mesopotamia and Persia, and they made significant contributions to the understanding of the movements of the celestial bodies and the measurement of time. Observatories were maintained in some of the empire's cities, and the observations that were made there were recorded and studied with great care. This knowledge of the stars and the planets had practical applications as well as intellectual ones, serving the needs of agriculture, navigation, and the calculation of the calendars that governed the religious and social life of the empire. The relationship between the Sassanid Empire and the Roman Empire to the west was one of the most significant and enduring rivalries of the ancient world, and the two great powers maintained a complex and often tense relationship throughout the centuries of their coexistence. Yet even during periods of conflict and rivalry, the flow of trade between the two empires continued, and the goods and ideas that moved along the routes connecting Roman and Sassanid territory enriched the cultures on both sides of the divide. Roman glass, textiles, and luxury goods found their way into Sassanid territory, and Sassanid silks, spices, and other products were eagerly sought after in the Roman world. The merchants who carried out this trade were bold and resourceful, individuals who navigated the complexities of imperial politics and the hazards of the road with skill and determination. The arts and intellectual life of the Sassanid Empire flourished under the patronage of the kings and the wealthy nobility, and the empire became a center of cultural achievement that influenced the civilizations of both the Islamic world that would succeed it and the Byzantine Empire to the west. The grand palaces and temples that were constructed during the Sassanid period were masterpieces of architecture, decorated with elaborate stucco work, paintings, and mosaics that reflected the artistic traditions of the empire and its cultural connections to the wider world. The libraries and academies that were maintained in the empire's cities preserved texts and knowledge from a wide range of intellectual traditions, and the scholars who worked in these institutions contributed to the advancement of learning in fields ranging from philosophy and theology to medicine and mathematics. The evening hours in a Sassanid household were a time of warmth and quiet companionship. When the work of the day was done and the family gathered together around the fire or in the sheltered courtyard of the home, the air carried the lingering smell of the evening meal, and the soft light of oil lamps or the glow of the fire cast a warm and gentle illumination over the faces of the family members as they relaxed and conversed. The children listened as their parents or grandparents recounted the stories and legends that were an essential part of the cultural life of the empire, their voices rising and falling in the ancient cadences of the storyteller's art. Outside, the sounds of the neighborhood settling down for the night drifted in through the open doorway or over the walls of the courtyard. The distant bark of a dog, the murmur of a neighbor's conversation, the soft stirring of the wind. The world beyond the household was vast and complex, stretching from the borders of Rome to the mountains of Central Asia. But within the walls of this modest home, the pace of life was slow and the concerns were simple, immediate, and deeply human. As the centuries of Sassanid rule continued, the empire maintained its position as one of the great powers of the ancient world, a center of culture and learning that connected the civilizations of East and West. The ordinary rhythms of daily life within its borders continued largely unchanged, shaped by the demands of agriculture, the teachings of the Zoroastrian faith, and the customs and traditions that had been passed down from one generation to the next over many centuries. The grand affairs of empire, the wars and the diplomatic negotiations and the political intrigues that occupied the attention of kings and nobles, were distant from the experience of most people, who knew them only as rumors and stories, filtering down from the centers of power. For the farmers and craftsmen and merchants who made up the bulk of the population, life was defined by simpler and more immediate concerns: the tending of crops and livestock, the care of family and community, the observance of the religious calendar, and the quiet enjoyment of the small pleasures that each day brought. The light of the setting sun fell across the landscape of the Sassanid Empire in the late afternoon hours, casting long shadows across the fields and the rooftops of the villages and towns. and turning the mud brick walls of the houses to a warm and golden color that seemed to glow from within. The air cooled gradually as the sun sank lower, and the sounds of the evening began to replace the activity of the day. The distant call of birds, the lowing of cattle being driven home from the pastures, the quiet conversations of neighbors greeting one another as they emerged from their homes in the cooler air. This was the world of the Sassanid Empire in its quieter moments, a world that stretched across a vast and varied landscape and was home to millions of people, living their lives in the shadow of one of the great empires of antiquity. It was a world of remarkable cultural achievement and intellectual vitality. But it was also, for most of its inhabitants, a world of simple and enduring routines of work and rest and the steady turning of the seasons that persisted quietly and continuously, shaped by the ancient rhythms of the land and the faith. For as long as the empire itself endured, the rivers of the Sassanid lands flowed onward through the seasons, carrying the waters of the mountains down to the plains and the sea, and the communities that depended upon them drew sustenance and life from their currents as they had done for countless generations before. The fishermen who worked the rivers of Mesopotamia set out their nets in the quiet hours of the early morning, when the water was still and the light was soft and golden on the surface, and the fish moved sluggishly in the cool of the shallows. The farmers who irrigated their fields drew water from the same rivers through channels and ditches that had been dug and maintained over many generations. And the sound of water flowing through these channels was a constant and familiar presence in the agricultural landscape, a sound that spoke of life and sustenance and the continuation of the ancient patterns of farming that had sustained the region for millennia. The merchants who traveled the trade routes of the Sassanid Empire moved through a landscape of extraordinary variety, from the green and irrigated plains of Mesopotamia to the barren and rocky deserts of the eastern regions, and from the scorching heat of the summer lowlands to the biting cold of the mountain passes in winter. These journeys were long and arduous, and the merchants who undertook them were experienced and resourceful individuals who understood the rhythms of the road and the verse demands of travel in the ancient world. The caravans that moved along these routes were typically large and well organized, with dozens or even hundreds of camels carrying loads of goods across the vast distances that separated one trading center from another. The caravanserais where these travelers rested and resupplied were places of considerable comfort and activity, and the gathering of merchants from many different lands and cultures in these establishments created an atmosphere of cosmopolitan exchange that was one of the most distinctive features of life along these great trade routes. The craft of glassmaking was one of the most refined and distinctive of the Sassanid artistic traditions, and the glass vessels and decorative objects produced by Sassanid craftsmen were among the most beautiful and technically accomplished of the ancient world. The glassblowers who practiced this art worked with molten glass, shaping it into vessels of various forms and decorating them with elaborate patterns of applied glass, painted designs, or cut decoration. The transparency and brilliance of the finished objects, which caught and reflected the light in ways that created an impression of extraordinary delicacy and refinement, made them prized possessions for the wealthy and important luxury goods in the trade networks that connected the Sassanid Empire to the wider world. The workshops where this glass was produced were found in several of the empire's cities, and the craftsmen who worked in them had mastered the techniques of their art through years of training and practice. The gardens of the Sassanid world were expressions of both aesthetic sensibility and practical necessity, providing shade and coolness in the hot climate of the empire's lowland regions as well as a supply of fruit, herbs, and other useful plants. The tradition of the enclosed garden, which had its roots in the ancient Persian culture and which would later exert Such a profound influence on the garden traditions of the Islamic world was cultivated with particular care and refinement during the Sassanid period. The most elaborate of these gardens were to be found on the estates of the wealthy and the powerful, where skilled gardeners created landscapes of extraordinary beauty, with fountains, pools, and channels of water winding through beds of flowers and beneath the shade of fruit trees. The fragrance of roses and other flowering plants filled the air in these gardens, and the sound of water created an atmosphere of tranquility and ease that was a welcome contrast to the heat and dust of the world beyond the garden. Walls dot the daily rhythms of life in the highland regions of the Sassanid Empire were shaped by the demands of pastoral farming and by the harsh conditions of the climate, and the communities that lived in these areas developed customs and practices suited to the particular challenges of their environment. The shepherds who tended the flocks of sheep and goats that grazed on the highland pastures were hardy and experienced individuals who knew the terrain and the habits of their animals with a non-intimacy born of a lifetime spent in the open air. In the summer months, they moved their flocks to the higher pastures, following routes that had been used for generations, and in winter they descended to the lower valleys, where the climate was milder and grazing could still be found. This annual migration, known as transhumance, was one of the defining rhythms of life in the highland regions, and it shaped the social customs, the economic activities, and the very identity of the communities that practiced it. The women of Sassanid households played an important role in the production of textiles and other goods needed by the family, and the work of spinning and weaving was a constant presence in the domestic life of most communities. Wool, obtained from the sheep that grazed on the pastures of the highland regions, was spun into thread using a drop spindle, and the thread was then woven on an upright loom into cloth of varying quality and fineness. The rhythmic sound of the shuttle passing back and forth through the warp threads was a familiar sound in the homes of the empire, and the skill of the weaver was judged by the quality and beauty of the cloth she produced. Some of the textiles produced in Sassanid households were used for domestic purposes, for clothing and blankets and household furnishings, while others were sold in the markets or traded with merchants who carried them to distant parts of the known world. The night sky over the Sassanid highlands was a magnificent spectacle on clear evenings, when the stars burned bright and cold in the darkness above, and the Milky Way stretched across the sky in a luminous band of light. The shepherds who spent their nights on the highland pastures, watching over their flocks in the cool and silent darkness, were familiar with the patterns of the stars and the movements of the planets, and they used this knowledge to navigate the routes that led across the mountains and to predict the changes in the weather that could bring danger to their animals and to themselves. The same sky that served these practical purposes also inspired a sense of wonder and a feeling of connection to the larger order of the universe, and the contemplation of the heavens was one of the quiet pleasures available to anyone who took the time to look upward. On a clear night, the markets and trading centers of the Sassanid Empire were places where the products of many different regions and cultures came together, and the variety of goods that could be found in these establishments was a testament to the empire's role as a crossroads of the ancient world. Silks from the empire's own workshops mingled with textiles from India and China, and spices from the east were displayed alongside the glassware and metalwork of local craftsmen. The merchants who bought and sold these goods were men of considerable experience and worldly knowledge, who had traveled far from their homes and had seen something of the civilizations that lay beyond the borders of the empire. Their stories and observations, shared in the tea houses and caravanserais where they rested between journeys, added to the flow of information and ideas that connected the Sassanid Empire to the wider world and enriched the cultural life of its inhabitants. The temples and sanctuaries of the Zoroastrian faith were distributed throughout the Sassanid Empire, and the rituals and observances that took place within them marked the passage of time and the important events of life for the empire's inhabitants. The daily tending of the sacred fire was a solemn and carefully prescribed ritual, performed by the priests with great attention to the forms and prayers that had been handed down through generations of religious practice. The major festivals of the Zoroastrian calendar, including Nowruz, the New Year's celebration at the spring equinox, and Sais the Badar, the 13th day of the new year when the community gathered in the open countryside, brought the people together in celebrations that combined religious observance with social enjoyment. The feasts that accompanied these festivals were occasions of considerable generosity and warmth, and the food that was prepared and shared reflected both the agricultural abundance of the region and the traditions of Persian hospitality that were deeply embedded in the culture of the empire. The slow and steady passage of time in the Sassanid lands was marked by the turning of the seasons and by the observances and celebrations that gave shape and meaning to the agricultural year. Each season brought its own particular tasks and pleasures, and the transition from one to the next was acknowledged and celebrated in ways that reflected the importance of these rhythms to the life of the community. The spring rains revived the land and signaled the beginning of the planting season, and the communities that depended upon the harvest greeted the return of the rains with a mixture of relief and anticipation. The summer heat drove the shepherds and their flocks to the cooler heights of the mountain pastures, and the farmers labored in the fields under the blazing sun, sustained by the knowledge that the harvest would come in due time. Autumn brought the gathering of the grain and the celebration of the festivals that marked the end of the agricultural year, and winter settled over the land with its shorter days and longer evenings, providing time for rest and reflection and the quiet enjoyment of family and community life.